So welcome, friends, to day 2 of our series of webinars reflecting on anti-racist in Christ, an important theme, especially for today as we think about the work of mission agencies. So you're all welcome, and we are glad to share with you and greet our panelists and you as attendees coming to share with us. So as we begin, we just want to share some technical information that will enable better participation. So we'll share screen just to explain. So for friends who would like to follow this later, we are recording the session, as you will see, and this is going to be available on the World Council of Churches YouTube channel. So you'll be able to see the recording of this webinar, but also all of our recordings, so yesterday's and the ones that are to come. So you can check it out, and on screen you should be able to see the information regarding this. We want to include your questions as much as possible. We have many panelists with much to say, and so sometimes it's not possible to have everything, but we're asking if you can please submit any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A function box, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. And then when you have any technical issues and you need support, then please use the chat function. And then you can choose the WCC C2M technical support and just indicate if you have a problem, and we'll try our best to assist you in connecting with what we're doing. So friends, thank you for joining us. I want to hand over to the Reverend Philip Peacock, who is the Executive Secretary for Justice with the World Council, World Union of Reformed Churches, and is going to moderate our session with his usual aplomb. So Philip, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. And friends, welcome to the second day of this series of webinars on anti-racist in Christ. We live in momentous times in which the reality of racism in its many manifestations are being made abundantly clear to us in so many ways and in different places across the world. Yesterday, as part of our webinar, we explored the question of setting racism within a colonial and neo-imperial context. We asked panelists whether the ideas of decolonization were good enough in uprooting racism from our context. And we came away with the idea that the way to move forward is really to develop strong and meaningful relationships. Today, we are asking a slightly different but related question, where we will be interrogating the relationship between mission agencies and racism as part of a colonial legacy. We do know that the 3 C's of colonialism, capitalism, and Christianity have worked together to create, really actually in modernity, the idea of racism, which was used not just as a theological and spiritual horizon under which colonialism took place, but also as a very strong political project that justified colonialism and imperialism in all its manifestations. This was really what fixed ideas of whiteness and blackness and set them into a particular hierarchy. Today, we will be looking and interrogating the contribution of mission agencies in perpetuating this oppression and injustice. And we have for us today a very, very exciting set of 6 panelists. And it is my joy to introduce them to you. Many of them are my close friends. We've worked together for a long time, and I can vouch very, very strongly for their expertise in this field. Our first panelist is the Dr. Gladson Jatana, who serves presently at the Pacific Theological College in Suva in Fiji as a senior lecturer in the history of Christianity. He has a number of publications to his name, and most importantly, has done very good historical work in uncovering the legacy of mission agencies. We are very happy to have also today with us the Reverend Dr. Thore Johnson, Bishop Johnson, Sami theologian, who's currently working as associate professor in the specialized university in Tromsø in Norway. He has been committed to the indigenous cause for a long time and has worked with the WCC's reference group on indigenous people. And I'm sure that he's going to bring these very strong indigenous perspectives for us. Dr. Malebogo Kalagimang presently serves as senior lecturer in New Testament and Gender Studies in the University of Botswana in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. She has done work in rereading Ngugi's post-colonial Bible, and she works at the intersections of the African novel and its religious constructions interwoven with post-colonial and feminist theories. We're also very happy to have from Samoa, the Reverend Latu Latai. He's an ordained minister of the Congregational Christian Church in Samoa and a senior lecturer in Church and Pacific History at Malua Theological College. Perhaps a close friend of many who are attending this meeting today, the very passionate and committed Palestinian theologian, Reverend Professor Dr. Mithri Raheb. He is the founder and president of Dar al-Kalima University College of Arts and Culture in Bethlehem. He has for several years written and struggled for the rights of the Palestinian people and has done amazing work in being able to link these struggles in the context of the struggle against imperialism. And we welcome him to this panel as well. And finally, but definitely not lastly, is the Professor Anthony Reddy, presently serving as the director of the Oxford Center of Religion and Culture in Regent's Park College in the University of Oxford. He's also extraordinary professor of theological ethics and research fellow with the University of South Africa. Professor Reddy comes from an outstanding academic background and has received the Archbishop of Canterbury's 2020 Lambert Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship. The number of marginalized and BIPOC people that he has mentored in academy just speaks for itself. And I take this opportunity to welcome this wonderful and distinguished set of panelists to our meeting today. We are not going to be following the usual format of having a lecture style, but rather this is going to be in the process of a conversation where I hope to engage all these distinguished panelists into a conversation. I would like to ask the communication team, the technical team at this time to put up the image that we have for you, and we will begin by asking each one of the panelists to offer a 3-minute reflection on this image that you see before you. And I'd like to start with Dr. Malebogo. What do you identify with in this image? What would you change about this image so that it might give hope to the world?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to you all from Gaborone, Botswana. Firstly, this picture was very much disturbing, and I wondered whether we use this in Sunday school, since I'm a product of the LMS Sunday school. Firstly, just a cursory look at the image, you know, it becomes me to remember Jesus making a call that, you know, let the little children come to me, for theirs is the kingdom. However, you know, this picture elicited a series of racialized discourses for me. About 2 or 3 issues literally disturbed me about this. Firstly, as a child, I think I would have identified with the little white girl, because it is the picture of, it is the picture I grew up seeing in visual culture, and even the dolls that I played with. Yet at the same time, I would not want to identify with a seemingly abandoned, marginal, outside and other child, even though the child does look like me, because it would make me feel unwanted. And it would also make me feel that I literally need to run to my mother and literally confess to her that, you know, the other kids are playing around with Jesus, and it seems Jesus doesn't want me to be part of the children. Yet as an adult, I am struggling with this picture, particularly with the image of the white Jesus and the distance between the white Jesus and the marginal Black child on the periphery. And I've been asking myself, what is a white Jesus doing in a world that is trying to do away with racial inequalities, with the racialized colonial images that we have been bombarded with throughout? And I wondered, is the Jesus constructed or painted in this picture a racist one? Because it seemingly excludes the child who happens to be Black. I mean, I don't want to underestimate that the painter might have been thinking that it's a Jesus who is calling out the children of color or the Black child from wherever they are. And I'm also wondering, why do we even need this visual culture of a missionary colonialism even during this time? I mean, I'm aware of the colonial legacies, but what is really this picture doing now in 21st century? More so that there have been so many decolonizing writings, decolonizing reflections. I mean, I'm thinking of liberation theology, Black liberation theologies who have contended with the Black, with the white Jesus. I'm thinking of feminists who have even asked the question, shall a male savior, white male savior, save us? So I'm just wondering, why do we even have to have this picture right now? And the question, what did I change about this picture? I just want to take a radical move and say I would even have to remove it from the list of visual objects, unless if we are really deconstructing the image of Jesus and even taking into consideration the scholarly debates and scholarly deconstructions that have come after the Renaissance images of a white, blonde, blue-eyed Jesus. So for me, it really elicited a lot of disturbing questions, and I'm still wondering, why are we invested in this visual culture from a colonial imperial times that perhaps maybe is because the image of Jesus has never left us. It is still a haunting image to all of us. I think that is where I really want to stop. Thank you very much. About the video, I can't start a video because it will slow down my internet. Okay, thank you so much.
We are very happy to have you here, and your voice at least. Thank you so much. Dr. Jatana, I think we pass this question on to you. And this image was produced by the LMS in 1915. Do you think it continues to speak in other parts of the world today?
Thank you, Philip. Agreeing completely with Dr. Malebogo, I would like to identify 3 dimensions in this, the picture offers, the image offers us. Number 1, I see Jesus. Jesus who is painted in missionaries' white ink. This image can serve as a powerful symbolic representation of the modern missionary movement that coincided colonial modernity that was constructed around the conviction of white man's burden to reach the non-white other, the kids, as an imposed identity in a subaltern world. However, this image also compels me to ask what really happened at the subaltern worlds of the missionized. In a conversion space in the non-white locations, I believe that more than the skin color of Jesus, the messianic politics of Jesus mattered to the missionized. For example, in my own social location in India, where racism and slavery are practiced in the form of casteism, Jesus resisted against sitting as a white, philanthropic, calm, patient, lovable, accommodative, storytelling Christ. Rather, he became a sojourner with his subaltern counterparts in their pilgrimage of equality and justice. That is where I see hope in this picture, or in rereading this picture. Number two, I see missionized bodies. The missionized bodies that embodied multiplicity and differences. Perhaps for Harold Copping, the artist, the missionized bodies meant to represent vulnerability and dependency. But the historiography of Christian mission forces us to read such intended meanings against the grain and see that these images of missionized bodies also sing a different saga of mutuality, saga of interdependency, solidarity, hope, and liberation. The missionized bodies, through their agonistic conversation with Jesus, convert white Jesus into Jesus of the soil, the liberator, and the Messiah of the multitude. This certainly gives us hope. The third dimension, I see margins. A marginal solitary hill in this image serves as a designed frame of the picture and also a destined framework of the mission. Within the Eurocentric mission projects, the margins are often defined and categorized as a site of vulnerability. It is assumed that the margin is always longing for empowerment and emancipation. This is indeed a racial construction. We need to see margins as potential sites of transfiguration and transformation. When mission archives like this picture is read against the grain, we encounter a number of untold narratives from the margin that go beyond colonial constructions of normative racial differences. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jatana. That was a fantastic rereading of this image from the perspective of the marginalized, taking their agency into account. We pass the mic now on to Dr. Thore Johnson and ask him, in his context, from a Sami perspective, who do you identify with in this image?
Thank you very much, Philip. Well, this is it is a disturbing and thought-provoking image when you look into it, and it also makes me feel uncomfortable, and I will say why. This I don't know whether you can see this, but this is an image of my father and my great-grandmother. When my father was born in 1918, still were Sami graveyards dug up. This was a time of skull measuring of races, and Sami skulls were actually also traded around Europe, because so it's also this old racist tradition in Europe, which also goes back to the tradition of monstrous races. But anyways, how is it relating to the image? Well, you see, my mother, my father was a Sami, my mother a Norwegian, and my mother came from the south north as a nurse in the Sami Mission Society, she married, or my father married. They married with a local Sami, and in many ways, I grew up within this somewhat tenuous space. I was raised in the Sami diaspora in southern Norway in a time when the Sami it is the Sami, for those of you that don't know about the Sami, is the indigenous people of the far north of Scandinavia and Northwest Russia, and it was almost non-existing in a southern Norwegian context. So where it existed in some way was among some friends in the Sami Mission Society. And I recall I was maybe 5, 6, 7 years old. Our family was attending a regional meeting in the south of this organization. And of course, an important part of it was also to tell mission histories from the mission field in the north, and also within this paternalistic framework. And all of a sudden, our family was called up on the stage. And I was sitting next to my father, And I remember to this day his emotional reaction. He became very angry, but it was not possible to get away from it. So we were standing there on the stage, and I remember to stay here in this very tense space of on the one way this overwhelming goodness of the missionary movement, and still this very uncomfortable that this was actually making us objects of mission. I was moving up north when I was 19 and working 2 years in this mission organization. I was happy that this probably made it possible for me to take back my Sami language. But anyways, this was a time where the Sami movement was strong, and the political movement, and also the critiques of Christianity. It was not very much it was much resistance in the mission movement and in the church of the critiques of the colonial legacy. I also heard things when I was saying, and some others with me, we should have a Sami leader of this organization. I heard from one older person that had a prominent role. Well, the Sami cannot be leaders. Well, they can be in charge of a reindeer herd, but to be structured and organize an organization, well, that's beyond that. It's not belong to the character of the Sami. And I said, what about my father? Well, he's not typically Sami, so that's why he is, well, and also I could hear that, well, to think that the objective of this organization should be actually that it is not necessary to have it, that the Sami can run their own Christian life. Well, this is a very Southern Norwegian way to think. The Sami will always depend on us. So actually, these things made me very angry, and I brought these questions into the theological study, and I think I would like to figure out these things myself. So coming back to this image, I think it is quite disturbing to see that all the children look at Jesus except for the blonde girl who looks at the objects of mission, which is interesting, I think, and I think what we should hope for is that the white church start to look at Christ instead. And probably in that movement, a transformation of the image of Christ will happen, that actually Christ was never white. And so thank you. I think that will be my perspective. And I think that will also, in realizing that, brings also a whole new vision of what kind of power relationships or what kind of spirit is Christ bringing to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Johnson. And that was very powerful, actually, to unveil these microaggressions and the everyday mundane banality of racism that works in the guise of paternalism, in the guise of messianism, and in the guise of salvation. And then to turn it around to ask where that white girl was looking and where she should be looking instead, I think has really done something for this conversation. Dr. Rahib, with your wealth of experience and your entire commitment to liberation, and particularly the liberation of the Palestinian people, and the deep theological issues that this involves, how does this image speak to you?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Actually, it reminded me when I saw it immediately of the church I was baptized in, I grew up in, and I served in for over 30 years. Because in the stained glass windows at Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, which was built by German missionaries in the 19th century, you have that blonde Scandinavian Jesus, that sweet, Jesus that we grew up with, and it became almost part of our identity. And I think, unfortunately, in many churches, even today, modern churches here, you can see this blonde Jesus. For me, I really couldn't identify with anyone in that picture, not with Jesus and not with the kids. For me, there were three questions that became important. One, is this a portrait of Jesus or is it a portrait of the West? I didn't see really Jesus there. What I saw was the West that think of itself as being good, bringing salvation, bringing goodness, bringing civilization to the rest of the world. And I think this somehow reflects the philosophy and the theology of that era. But secondly, I asked myself, who is missing there? I mean, you have different races. Interestingly enough, you will not find anyone there from the Middle East. Though actually Jesus was a Middle Eastern guy, a Middle Eastern person, a Palestinian Jew. So that aspect is totally missing, which is interesting. I mean, we're thinking of mission agency who are supposed really to do at least some homework. Even that little homework is not being done. And the third element I saw there is really, it reminded me of what Edward Said, another Palestinian, called Orientalism. It is really, you can see there how the West is portrayed and the powerless children from the rest of the world. And so you know who's the master, who's in control of things, and how actually the people in the mission field are seen as objects to be actually colonized. That's the thing. So Jesus is not bringing in this picture the good news. What he's bringing actually, he's bringing their colonization, their occupation, and their enslavement. So these were the three elements I thought might be interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Raheb. Very telling that the one Middle Eastern person who should have been there has literally been whitewashed. We pass on now to Reverend Latu Latai from Samoa. And does this image resonate in your experience in the Pacific and in Samoa? And how would you reflect on it? I think you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I come from the Pacific, which is the largest ocean in the world, and so that's the one thing that that was missing for me in terms of the image. But I also come from a region in the world which is in almost 90% of the countries in it. The population are close to 100% Christian. I say that because Christianity, the history of Christianity in the Pacific, it's a very glorified history. And for that, it's one of the challenges that we face is our church is still struggling to really critique the church and the history, the colonial history of the church. When I first saw the image, it just reminded me of all the other images that you see in the houses of Pacific Islanders when we were growing up. Images in the houses and of course in the churches. But my concern is that is how much Pacific people have internalized these racialized ideas, and and I think we really haven't really critiqued these images. We have sort of accepted us since the missionaries. And one of the thing, I mean, I also agree with the other previous speakers. I find it problematic myself. But for me, I'm not really into cancel history or cancel culture. And I want to use this image to educate our people and to really tell them about that history of colonial Christianity and those racist ideologies that are ingrained in such images. So for me, although I totally do not relate to this image, I still strongly believe that these images, we need to use these images to educate our people and to really decolonize the way that they think, the way that they have internalized and have accepted these very racist ideals. I have recently been involved in a review committee for Christian education material for our church. These are the materials that we use to teach Sunday schools here in Samoa for children and young people. And can you believe it? These are the materials that were written by the missionaries 100 years ago. And what I find disturbing is that a lot of these materials contain the Western cultural ideas of superiority, gender ideologies, Western patriarchy. But most strikingly, the illustrations that we use, which were mostly white children, white families, white men and women. So, so one of the things that we did was to get local artists and to come up with new illustrations that reflect our local people and our local culture. So to answer your question, do I identify with this image? No. What would I change about this image? For me personally, I don't want to change it because I want to use it to tell, to educate our people about the colonial ideas that are ingrained in such images. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Reddy, you perhaps famously known for asking the question, is God colorblind? And here in this image, we find people of all different colors, including a blonde-haired white Jesus. How does this resonate with your question, is God colorblind? What do you identify with and what would you change?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think along with everyone else, I find this picture very, very disturbing. The two things I noted straight away from looking at the picture was obviously the blonde white Jesus, but obviously like the naked black child who's lying down, whose face you can't see, and who is not seated, and therefore for me sort of seems the most distant from the image of Jesus. I think what I take from this, I think, has been what a number of Afrocentric scholars have reflected on, is this ontological violence, really, that sits at the heart of this. I think it was Marcus Garvey, one of the sort of great sort of Pan-Africanist kind of leaders at the start of the early part of the 20th century, said that any people who worship a God that doesn't look like them, and more importantly, looks like the people who have oppressed them, are people who are already committing a form of internalized genocide against themselves. And therefore what I see in this, I see a form of ontological violence that has taught Black people to hate ourselves through the aegis of Christianity. that is writ large in that picture. For me, what I would do with that is just simply to put it in a box, stick it in the ground, put it away, and never have to see it again, as far as I'm concerned. Unless we use it within a teaching context, within theological education, I think that's fine to critique it. I find the problem is that, much as I think other people have said, that this has been so internalized within the body politic of so many of our churches that even now it's not uncommon to find Black majority churches with those images still on walls with pictures of a white Jesus that hates us. Hates us. Let's be very, very clear here that this Jesus had no interest in our well-being whatsoever. Hated us. Therefore, I'm with James Cone. That the only thing actually that we can do with a white Christ is to kill him. Quite simply. Or alternatively, if not kill him, then stick him in a box and stick it in the ground and hide him away and just keep him well away from us. Because so long as we are worshipping gods that look like the people who have tormented us and have oppressed us, then quite simply, we will always be engaged in forms of self-negation that will do us no good.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting first round of conversation, where on the one hand, we see, as Professor Reddy has spoken about, the deep ontological violence that such images produce and reproduce on the one hand, and Dr. Jatana on the other, who spoke about how these images were appropriated in a completely different way from those who were on the margins. And also how these images actually affected us personally through microaggressions, through actual violence, but also at the same time, as Dr. Rahib pointed out, that these images also serve to invisibilize people, to move them away. People who should be there are not. The church has borne the responsibility in its theology, in its liturgy, in its images, in its architecture of creating and perpetuating actually racialized inequalities, both in its theology, but also in its politics and in the way that it organizes the social world. So in the symbolic as well as in the material world, we find that the church has been involved in perpetuating racialized inequalities that we witness today. So I would like to now turn to Dr. Johnson and Dr. Tagalimang to reflect very quickly for us, what responsibility do you think that the church holds in this?
You want me to start, Philip, or?
Yes, please. I would like Dr. Johnson to start.
Thank you very much. This is a very important question, and I think I would start to reflect on the challenges of actually going in depth into this question, because I think when it comes to raising the question about the responsibilities the churches and the mission agencies bear, you will very soon meet resistance among in these circles, and often I think that these kind of conversations tend easily to center on the persons, the agents of the historical actors, were they good and bad? And as, for instance, my first story, it was indicating, oftentimes the violence is wrapped in also very well-intentioned, benevolent kind of approaches. So this is kind of hidden, and I think this is, so this tendency of being personalized, the issue, or being a very church-centric way of approaching it, saying that, well, but the church, colonialization was a bad thing, and yes, we were part of it and benefited of it maybe, but we were at least better, and without us it would have been much worse. And I think this kind of approaches prevents us from actually going really in depth of and actually looking into the ideological frameworks and logics, and how theology really actually naturalized this way of looking at the world. So and I think this is relates to lots of questions, also including a massive land grabbing, actually, historically, and legitimizing it. So I think I'll start with that.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Malebogo.
Okay, thank you so much. One thing that this question elicited from me was the famous African dictum: when the white man came to Africa, we had the land and he had the Bible, and he said, let us pray. And after we had said amen, we were left holding the Bible, clutching the Bible, and the white man had, the colonial missionary had the land. And I'm beginning there because the responsibility of the church, particularly in Southern Africa, has really been silent on the questions of missionary colonial responsibilities towards land ownership, land taking. I mean, where I'm sitting currently, we've got hectares of big chunks of land that belong to one mainland church. And these are big lands that have been rented out to various malls. And we don't even know where the money goes. It doesn't really remain in the country. So firstly, for me, it's how the church has ignored or has remained silent. I mean, sometimes they've said, well, when we're building hospitals and schools in your land, that money came from somewhere. Well, well and good, but the church has never really interrogated its role in grabbing land, and how grabbing some of these things have implicated the citizenry, because the citizenry has suffered in the end. So the questions of the responsibilities is that, I mean, they're basically long, difficult, and unfortunately uncomfortable, because the church and mission agencies are yet to exercise the history of racialized inequalities. They are yet to really begin to interrogate how they have played a role in shaping accessibility to certain materialist or basic needs that communities need, for example. So racial inequalities are a thorn for me in the flesh of most churches. And also, I think the responsibility that the church bears is the sense of silence, the sense of apathy, the sin of indifferences, and possibly it's maybe we also as citizenry, we are part of these churches, that to even ask, to even interrogate what we have inherited from these churches, it makes us also uncomfortable, and even maybe raises theological questions of forgiveness and repentance. I mean, maybe I'm veering off the lane, but sometimes I think you hear sentiments like, well, we have to forgive and let go, but these are sins that are really affecting us. So for me, it's the failure of churches in taking responsibilities, in owning their own role in this institution of racism, in owning their role in places of privilege, and how churches have controlled the narrative of interrogating racism, of interrogating the silence of apathy. I'm not racist. I live among Black people. You hear such sentiments from from missionaries. I live among Black people. I've ministered to them. So I live with them. Sometimes I'm even married to one. So the church for me has not really confronted such, especially the institution of racism, have not even acknowledged the complexities of even rethinking racial reconciliation. Because the moment we begin to acknowledge that the church has really played a role, not only in racism, but even in gender exclusions of women from ordination, we really have to also be thinking of radical and robust forms of racial transformation. So I think because the church is privileged in so many different ways, it's privileged because of maybe of the quote unquote diverse members of the congregation. Churches have also been implicated in the narrative, in controlling the narrative of discussions, in controlling even the questions of historical legacies of colonialism and how they've come to find representation, to find continuity, even to find maybe shielding and apology in the current churches. I want to think that is where I want to place it. I mean, for me, it's all muddled in those complexities, but by placing it as complexities, I'm not really saying we should interrogate it. But I also do find that the church is ambivalent sometimes in the way that it acknowledges its history of colonial missionary and colonial legacies of racism and race. And at the same time, it wants to portray that it has moved on from those legacies. But history is not easily erased, neither easily discarded, because it still comes to control and even to the genre of history comes in to shape how we think about each other and how we even think about our relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Someone once said that the Bible should come with a warning on its first page. And the warning should read that reading this book may cause you to occupy other people's land. This conversation has taken a very interesting turn, actually, because we're moving away from the usual trope of saying it is the church's theology which is to blame, to looking at the church's actual involvement in the materiality of racism and colonialism. I am now going to ask two people to respond to this aspect. The first is Dr. Reddy, and then followed by Dr. Jatana.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the most, well, I guess two of the most significant things that have happened to me in terms of my own scholarship, really, have been opportunities when I've been, I think, jolted into a reminder of some of the inherent flaws within the construction of Christian theology in itself that have lent it to be a handmaiden for empire and imperialism. So the first was the first time I read Voices from the Margin, edited by my great friend and a great scholar, Aris Sugatha Raja. And within that, I think the section where it looks at land, and I think in particular of the articles by Robert Warrior and one by Naim Atik, and both, I think, are very, very important critiques of the Exodus narrative, because I think one of the things that often happens, and we know this actually within the aegis of empire, is how there's always been this classic divide and rule. So you find ways of pitting groups against each other and doing so in order that the power of empire itself is camouflaged. And so I remember reading this and just never noticing that the hidden in plain sight is that this is not a text just of liberation. It's a text of liberation if you identify with the Israelites, if you identify with those people who are supposedly have been taken into exile and are looking for a promised land. And certainly as someone whose forebears were enslaved Africans who were taken from Africa into the so-called New World under the aegis of chattel slavery, of course. That reads like a liberative text, but of course, if you are identifying as someone who is indigenous to the land itself, of course, that reads in a very, very different way. But what scared me was how I'd never seen it. It was hidden in plain sight. That right in front of me was texts of genocide, texts of ethnic cleansing. I never saw it. Years later, I was reading Kelly Brown Douglas's book, What's Faith Got to Do with It? And within that context, Kelly Brown Douglas is probably the leading womanist theologian. And within that, she talks about this sense of, within the Hebrew scriptures, of having a God that is jealous, that doesn't tolerate the worship of other gods. And she talked, I think the term she talks about is a competitive monotheism. So what does it mean to have a God that not only wants fidelity to God's self, but has a abhorrence of other gods as constructed within the text? Now, often once then you then see that as being the template that then helps then to generate Christianity. Actually, is it any wonder then that empire then almost happens as a handmaiden from the first? Because actually, once like you've already got a competitive God that's not going to tolerate other gods, and therefore the people who worship that God are at a material advantage in terms of their identity with God's self, then other people are automatically othered, and not only othered, then therefore like they have no agency. Therefore, what struck me again, actually, if you go back to the Exodus narratives and then the book of Joshua, is how all the people who are being exploited have no voice. What you have is a propaganda against them. So it's interesting that there's no agency for the various ites that are being oppressed and their lands being usurped. So therefore, is it any wonder then that when you then think of the missionary imperative to take land, to colonize it, to create space for oneself, these are all the things that I think Willie James Jennings talks about in his magisterial book, like The Christian Imagination, the way in which central to whiteness under missionary agency is to create space. So therefore, it's no wonder that what you have are various forms of apartheid, various forms of ways of separation from the other in order to stop notions of contamination, and think of how powerful notions of purity are within the colonial mindset. Part of I think the biggest problem we have, certainly as liberationists, as ourselves, is, one thing I want to say is that I remember when I was a kid and I used to go out and you kind of pick apples from trees. Actually, we call it scrumping. Don't know where that word came from. That's what we used to pick up. And the thing I can occasionally remember was that you get a bruised apple, and so you cut away all the bruised bit, so you could then eat all the healthy bit. But after a while, there's some apples that were so bruised that once you cut all the bits away, you don't have much of the apple left. And therefore, I think one of the critical questions sometimes I find myself wrestling with is how much of this Christianity can I cut away before what is left is, quite frankly, just not usable anymore?
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Reddy. Dr. Jatana.
Respond to this question quickly or briefly. I would think it is undeniable that the modern missionary movement imposed a Eurocentric, which is also an ethnocentric, racial supremacy of the white over all the others. And we have been experiencing the impact of that even today. Without contesting that fact, I would like to ask, is it enough to hold colonial Christian mission alone responsible for the racial inequalities we experience and witness today? In my opinion, we need to move beyond reducing racism to Christian mission agencies and their nexus with colonialism. The multiple manifestations of racism beyond colonialism and mission show us the existence of supremacist ideologies of multiple hierarchies and exclusion everywhere, including in the pre-colonial and post-colonial indigenous context too. Should we not address that? As we learn from Indian history, for example, racism and slavery were practiced even in the pre-colonial context in the form of casteism. And it continues to be a haunting reality in the post-colonial India and also in the diaspora too. Or take, for example, the plight of the migrant Indians in post-colonial context who were brought as indentured slave laborers by the British. It is important to hold British responsible for their colonial politics of divide and rule. But I think it is equally important to critically interrogate the role of contemporary church and mission agencies in the ongoing racial segregation and violence. Therefore, we have to hold churches and our missional manifestation. I mean, not only the historical colonial missional manifestation, but also our contemporary missional and ecumenical manifestations, including in the non-European context, responsible for perpetuating racially tooled violence of various forms. I think that would be my brief response to the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jantan. I'm particularly bringing this into the present time. It's not just a legacy, but we also see, particularly with the context of Black Lives Matter and the resistance that's coming against it from our Christian constituency. This is something I think that you brought as being really important. We have two questions. We have a number of questions actually in our chat box, but I want to raise particularly two. The first one actually picks up from where we talked about this materiality of the colonial legacy of missionary societies. And to quote actually what Peter Cruchley would call missionary capitalism. And the question relates to saying, can we also see the image as marketing propaganda by the LMS as a missionary society, predominantly white, to share with its supporters about what this institution was doing, making Christians from children, innocent children across the world? Are we willing to critique mission agencies in their evangelical zealousness? And I would like to particularly direct this question to Dr. Rahim.
I mean, I think definitely, but let me maybe come to what we heard just that, I mean, colonization for us here is still a reality today. So for me, I cannot yet talk only about the history. Because, and again, about the materiality. If you live in Palestine, you know, this is supposed to be the Holy Land, and the Holy Land is an industry, right? Now, all the holy places are controlled by foreign churches. So you have either Greeks, or you have either, you know, Italian monks, or you have Germans, etc. They are controlling all the prime land that is part of the Holy Land industry. And the local churches here are kept on a kind of life support. You know, they give them just enough so that they will not go to starvation. And so for me, I see this, it's not a legacy anymore. It's still something that is continuing in the church itself. And so it's not only that our land, Palestinian land, is occupied by Israel. Unfortunately, our churches are occupied still by these churches. And I come now to the second question. So this is the historic development that led us to today. But if I look at the evangelical movement, they are now coming from the US with their ideology, pouring lots of money into colonizing minds. So you can see how even young Palestinians in Nazareth or somewhere else become and are buying into a Christian Zionist ideology that is actually against their own being their own existence, but again, it is this colonized mind that is brought with lots of power, material power, but also ideological power. So our struggle in Palestine is still, we are not done yet. We are in the middle of it. I will come later to talk about being colonized by Israel and what the church there is doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a deeply theological question now that is being asked by Dr. Anderson Jeremiah. And he actually is asking us, has theology not only this, he asks this question from desire actually, and asking us to reflect on the colonial desire for capturing, dominating, and domesticating not only humanity, but also the divine, also God. So there is not just a movement to domesticate other people, but in this, perhaps even preceding this, arises a desire to domesticate God. And what are the implications of this? And I'm going to ask Reverend Latu to reflect on this question for us. Reverend Latu, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Apologies. Again, I would have to speak from my perspective here in the Pacific region. And of course, the impact of colonization in the Pacific region differs from places to places. But what I find one of the hurdles that we are facing with our churches is the unwillingness to self-critique, and also the willingness to break away from the colonial past. So it's some form of neo-colonialism, particularly within our church leaders. And I think it also to do with the privileged position of the churches in the Pacific, because the evangelization of the Pacific has been very successful. So therefore, we are struggling to critique that colonial history and to move forward. So from that perspective, I find that this is the challenge. This is the challenge, and how do we decolonize these racist ideas when, in fact, our churches with here in the Pacific are also perpetuating this missionary ideas that were brought since the coming of the Christianity in the Pacific. I'm not sure if I've referred to the question that was asked, but this is the challenge. This is the challenge with here in the Pacific, particularly with the new evangelical movement churches and the new theology that is coming in from the United States, which continue to propagate this white supremacy form of Christianity.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a couple of questions from Mika Purba in the chat that talks about Jesus in the image as being this white old man, and this being an image that we grew up with. Instead of answering this question directly, I want to link it to a question that we already had as part of this discussion, and perhaps the elephant in the room that Anthony very clearly addressed, but I'm going to push him a bit more on this and simply ask, Professor Reddy, what do we do with the white Jesus? I mean, I know you said kill him. I know you said put him in the box, but do you want to flesh this out? And has decolonization exorcised this racist reality from our churches? and mission agencies?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to be clear, though, when I'm sort of saying that we killed the white Jesus, I think to take this from James Cone is because the white Jesus is the Antichrist. That is not Christ, it is an imposter, and therefore what we're doing is not effectively, you know, I mean, so I'm not saying I have the hubris that like we kill God, you know. I mean, it's interesting that I think Western Christianity has already had like the hubris of talking about like the death of God. So I'm not. That's a different theological model. I think for me, this goes back to the previous point I made about this whole point around sort of when we're sort of deconstructing the ways in which Christianity has been distorted. I think we have to acknowledge that the distortion didn't happen yesterday. It's been a long time in the making, that even in the very construction of Christian theology itself, there are ideas that give rise to imperialism and notions of conquest and control. So therefore, I think we have to be honest and say, to what extent can we remake this model of Christianity to be habitable for ourselves is a struggle, but obviously there are various things that we can do. Certainly, I think indigenization of the church in its proper sense, and what I mean by that is, I don't mean a form of colorization. So what I mean by colorization, which I've written about in a previous piece of work, is that like you'll find in various sort of colonial forms of Christianity, they'll say, okay, well, let's have a Jesus that is black. So let's take that picture that we saw, put a black Jesus in it, that makes it better. Well, here's the thing. If the black Jesus is going to do the same thing that the white Jesus did, but it's just that it's got black skin, that misses the point, because all that then does then is just re-articulate and re-imbibe like the very tropes of colonialism and empire that we're trying to deconstruct. So therefore, what we have to say is what is the very point of Jesus? What is it that Jesus is trying to do? And if Jesus is still trying, if a Jesus of color is still trying to do the same thing that the white Jesus did, then all we're simply doing is just rearranging sort of deck chairs on the Titanic. Therefore, what we need is, I think, is a clear epistemological break that says, actually, a Jesus that is on the side of the subalterns is of a wholly different character and context. It's not about his skin color, which obviously is symbolic and important, but it's about what's the intent. And the intent has to be one of solidarity with people on the margin. So for me, I want to go right back to the Jesus of history, and to go back to that Palestinian Jew who doesn't create a church, that's what Paul does, but actually is on the sides of the margins and is not creating an institution, but actually is trying to evoke a revolution of love.
Thank you, Anthony. And I think that also fed very much into the question that Dr. Anderson was asking. It seems to me also that if you have this black Jesus, and then the black Jesus also exists at the same time as the white Jesus, and everyone has their own Jesus, this also justifies a certain kind of plurality that has its roots in segregation. So this is a very difficult proposition, and it really leads to our domestication of God. So with these two questions about what do we do with the white Jesus, who is a product of the domestication, not just of humans, but also with God, I would like to ask Dr. Jatana, how would you reflect on this? Dr. Jatana, you would have to unmute yourself.
Apologies. I would really go back to the question that was raised by Jeremiah Anderson, a very, very important question about the colonial domestication and the colonial desire to domesticate, control God. I think this question has been one of the very profound way of looking into it is to name this God as ungod. Sebastian Capon, an Indian Jesuit theologian, already said that ungod is the God whom Christians fashioned to legitimize their lust for wealth and power. I think this resonates very well with the question that is raised today. Having said that, I also would like to see that how this colonial desire continues even in the post-colonial realities in the imperial structures within post-colonial contexts. In terms of multiple manifestations of power and the colonial desire. And now coming back to this, what do we do with the white Jesus? To answer this question that demands a Christological and missiological reimagination, in fact, I take refuge in three important and profound Christological reflections coming from different social realities. First, James Cone's assertion that there is no truth in Jesus Christ independent of the oppressed of the land. It is the interdependence of Jesus and the oppressed, the missionized in our context, that moves beyond racial differences is what matters for us today in our search for meaning to understand Christ and Christian mission in a world tormented by racial violence and racialized inequalities. My second refuge is Jörg Rieger's profound statement. He says, while there are no pristine forms of Christology where Christ would be completely independent of the metamorphosis of empire, there are various forms of resistance to empire and fresh inspiration for alternative images of Christ. In my opinion, decolonization is an ongoing movement where resistance to empire is either rooted or results in reimagining alternative images of Christ. As the Christ of mission agencies became an anti-caste messiah in India, in the Dalit resistance to Brahminical empire, which I have been referring again and again, so does Christ emerge as an anti-imperial, anti-racist manifestation in different post-colonial contexts today. The negotiation of the subaltern subjects of Christian mission with the white Jesus opens up new vistas of anti-imperial imaginations, because these subalterns and Jesus himself help each other not to be co-opted by racist empires at any cost. Third, to answer this question, we may have to ask, first of all, do we in the subaltern world really see Jesus parallel to our white colonial masters or even native indigenous empires? Slavoj Žižek perhaps answers this question rather romantically. He says, for us, Jesus is a common man walking in common places. So living in such a marginal common space in a mutual relationship for us, perhaps, is a source of resistance and hope. Therefore, I believe that our decolonization efforts must also dare to unmask and exorcise the racist within us, the post-colonial subjects. Of course, it is certainly important that we keep revisiting the legacies of racism within Western colonialism and Christian mission. That will indeed provide us new perspectives and directions to reformulate our Christologies, missiologies, and mission models. That's what we are doing today. And it will also offer an opportunity, certainly, to our white friends, partners in the mission of justice and peace, to negotiate with their whiteness and to creatively and sensitively deal with the privileges and power that their whiteness might bring as default. However, having said that, we need to admit racism has multiple avatars. There are manifestations of racism that have little or nothing to do with Western colonialism and Christian mission. I say this as a student of historiography of Christian mission, and I want to stress on that. Just to name a few, which I already said, casteism in India, or racism among different indigenous ethnic groups, continued oppression of the indentured slave laborers in post-colonial locations, and so on. Sometimes, unfortunately, in the name of decolonization, we are so comfortable with creating white as an external enemy. But it is dangerous. It is dangerous because it enables us to hide behind the usual finger pointing, which may be based on a true observation, but hardly useful when it becomes merely a way of externalizing, avoiding our own racist cruelties in a post-colonial in indigenous locations. So I think that would be my understanding, Philip. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jatana. We will now move to asking Dr. Raheb and Reverend Latu the same question, but to answer it very, very briefly, what do we do with the white Jesus? Dr. Raheb, I will have to ask you to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you know, the white Jesus is still, unfortunately, a source of our misery here in Palestine, because it was British Protestant, actually politicians and missionary who really came up with the idea that European Jews should go to their homeland, which is Palestine, as colonizers, as actually subcontractors to the British Empire. And this reality for us, it's not a post-colonial reality because we are still living that. I mean, just yesterday, the new Israeli Prime Minister is a settler, that his party is still actually promoting today the colonization of Palestine. So this is not something from the 17th century, 16th century, it's today. And you have actually, you had Trump and all of his people, the evangelicals who were supporting the white Jesus, who was supporting actually the continuation of the colonization of Palestine. And I guess what we need to do with the white Jesus, and for me, the white Jesus means actually that theology that supports settler colonialism. Because people do not realize that what we experience in Palestine is settler colonialism. It's exactly what people, the native people in North America experienced, or in South Africa, or in Australia, etc. But we are experiencing this today through the white Jesus and through the white supremacy that here actually we experience as Israeli supremacy. And so we need really to deconstruct this settler colonial ideology, or what I call the software. Because our problem in Palestine is not only with the hardware, it's not only with the military backing that Israel gets from Europe and the US, but with the software theology that is being propagated and taught at Christian seminaries that really connect the biblical Israel with the state of Israel today. And so we become the aliens at home, and our colonizations become actually the fulfillment of God's promises. So we need actually to not only to deconstruct this kind of white Jesus, but to expose the white Jesus as actually the colonizer, and to develop a theology of resistance that really develop our own narrative, our own story that is being told, because unfortunately, we were not for a long time able to tell our own story. Our story was always told by the West. It's still being told as the West. And this is part of, you know, settler colonialism that view us as violent, as savage, etc. And they want to tell our story. So we need to develop more and more contextual theology, decolonial theology that tells really the stories of all of us gathered here today.
Thank you, Dr. Raheb. And there has been a question in the question and answer from Andrew Glenn, who has been asking about the implications of developing a post-colonial Christology. And I hope that the answers that are being offered in this round of questions are actually contributing to this. But now to move to Reverend Latu, really from a Pacific perspective, what do we do with white Jesus? Again, I will ask you. Thank you.
Sorry there. what do we do with the white Jesus? I think that for me personally, and also from a Pacific perspective, we need to move beyond the colonial representation of Jesus and to really read the gospel and the message of Jesus from our own context and from our own, that our theology is grounded in our own context and so that it makes sense and it's relevant to our context. For so long, we've had this. We were made to believe that this is the Jesus that from the Eurocentric perspective, but I think there is still a long way to go in terms of really deconstructing that colonial image of Jesus and moving beyond it and really change the conversation, change the narrative that incorporates our own context and what is relevant. I think for me personally, I think that's the only way that we can move on and we can really exercise this racist reality that is ingrained in this in the sort of a Christ and Christianity that was brought in from Europe.
Thank you. We now move to a more constructive question. How do we repair the damage done by colonialism and racism in your context? I'm going to ask Dr. Raheb, followed by Reverend Latu, to very quickly give us some insight on this, and then ask Bishop Torre and Dr. Malibogo to conclude this particular question. How do we repair the damage done by colonialism and racism?
I mean, as I said before, I don't think, at least that it is easy to repair because the damage is so vast, global, that thinking of repairing is really not an easy task. I would think we need really to resist and fight. I think we are still in this space of resisting and fighting. We are not yet in the phase of repairing, because to repair we need much more resources, and we need a different kind of network. We need to expose the colonialism, because unfortunately still many people don't see colonialism. They don't see what is happening today in our countries all over the world. They think this is just something that happens. And so exposing it, writing our own stories, songs, and disseminating our ideas, our theologies. I think these are the first step. Repairing, I mean, how would you repair the damage done, for example, in Palestine? It is so difficult. And yet, we are in the middle of the struggle, and I don't yet see a way to repair, unfortunately.
Thank you. Reverend Latu.
Thank you. I think for me, in order for us to move forward and in order for us to heal, we must always look back in history. And for me, we need to acknowledge how evangelization worked hand in glove with colonialism. And I think for me, that is the first step. We need to acknowledge the role and how Christianity was implicated in colonialism. That Christianity and colonialism were two branches of the same entity. And I think that the church, particularly the churches in the West, have not fully acknowledged that, the damage that has been caused, particularly to indigenous people throughout the world. Recently, I read somewhere an analogy of two hands clapping to describe the colonization of the Pacific, which really implies that islanders and Europeans were equal participants in this colonial process, which is nothing could be further from the truth. In many places in the Pacific, it was more like one hand slapping and the other hand fending and trying to protect. Just last week in New Zealand, a conservative politician of the National Party in the New Zealand government made a comment that caused outrage from the indigenous people of New Zealand. And he said in Parliament that colonization has been a good thing for Maori people. So really, even in the context that we are living at the moment, we still have a long way to go. And for me, the process of healing begins with us, with the church, acknowledging the role and taking responsibility in acknowledging. And also, I think for the Pacific region, it's very important that we educate our people, because we've always been presented with this glorified history of Christianity as the light that came in and make the Pacific the end of the dark age. So, but we all know that in the Pacific, a lot of countries, the Hawaiians in Hawaii, the Maoris in New Zealand, the Aborigines in Australia are still going through this really difficult place of trying to heal from the impacts and the damage that has been caused by colonization. So yes, we need to move forward, but we also need to acknowledge and to really educate our people about our past and our identity as Christians.
Thank you so much. Closing remarks from Bishop Torre and then from Dr. Malibogo.
Thank you very much, Philip. Well, I will, this is of course a large question. I will focus on one, and I will say that, well, in terms of working on our theologies, first I will say that, well, churches should participate in decolonizing practices. And I think by doing that, you will also get a new epistemological, a new insight of the world. But going to theology, I think I would warn against that we are using Christology as a compensatory tool. And I think that was what Anthony was also warning about, is to paint Christ black and the system, the larger system remains the same, is actually not solving the problem. So I'm saying this actually from my own doctoral research on what I call the North Sami everyday Christianity, which is, our Christianity is mostly oral and also embedded in indigenous practices. And one woman told me she was raised most of the year as a reindeer herder, well, in a traditional love or guahti or tipi like. She told about her mother had learned her, but well, Ibmelahji, God the Father, is in these high mountains and in the trees and in these stones and in everything. And when I started to listen to people, I started to understand that actually when people talked about God, they talked about the world, right? And the way people talk about the world is actually informing how the concept of God. These things are very intertwined. So and what I realized that actually very much of the Sami practices related to nature are easily interpreted as magic, as paganism, and so forth, because it is assumed a very hierarchical world view of the world, where based on dichotomies, where also this human nature relationship is so actually when you assume this very hierarchical way of seeing the world, what actually what to that woman and in this tradition is actually a way of practicing humility and a social logic that extends beyond the human family and also to the invisible, is easily said that this is magic. And I think this is and this the very much of the Christian hierarchical worldview was actually a filtering through a Greek concept, the great chain of being. And I think that the racial hierarchy is actually just one addition to that. And I think if we don't deal with whether how we construct the reality in hierarchically or more egalitarian, then actually if you drop Christ or God into it uncritically, it only blesses the system. So what we assume to be well-ordered relationships or not well-ordered relationships is very much based on our worldviews. So I think the problem is also whether our Christology is blessing is a top-down Christology or a bottom-up in terms of the colonial world, so actually what I realized that in my Sami research participants were not talking so much, they were talking very much about Ibmelach, God the Father, and the term Lord, for instance, is actually not used in the vernacular because is this a label used on non-Sami persons that are actually acting arrogantly in this hierarchical way of organizing the world. So I think that is my suggestion, that we should also look beyond Christology in a limited sense and look on the larger hierarchical logics that also extend to much broader than also racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop. And now to have Dr. Malegobo have the last word at this meeting.
Thank you so much. How do we repair the damage done by colonialism and racism in my context? I think I want to share sentiments with Reverend Dr. Raheb that resistance, I think, is the way to go. I'm mainly saying this because I come from a context whereby ideologies and techniques of denials are the order of the day. That to even acknowledge our own indigenous or native ideologies of exclusion or of tribalism and ethnocentrism, it's one of the most difficult things. So to even speak about it, the moment you voice it out, you voice out that we are living in a culture where ethnocentrism and tribalism are rife, you are the one who is accused of being a tribalist. And and even to acknowledge that there are sentiments, I mean, there are pockets of racist ideologies that are still controlling the culture. It's one thing that, you know, my culture would not even accept or even want to interrogate that. So the resistant motive for me works because repairing, healing, when you have not even acknowledged a sickness, it's for me, it's a far-fetched dream. So I think, because coming from that culture whereby ethnocentrism is really the order of the day in terms of politically, socially, economically, it's really difficult to think about repair and even healing. So forms of resistance for me are the most important thing, particularly in terms of patriarchy, gender, you know, sexual exclusions. That is where I think resistance, it's more important. The decoloniality, it's more important. and even to decolonize, but you can only decolonize if you realize how colonialism functions, not only white colonialism. I think there's somebody who spoke about multiple avatars of racism. Yeah, so just think about how even native or indigenous practices of ethnocentrism are also forms of colonialism, by colonizing the other, by even refusing languages to be acknowledged and even accepted. So for me, I think resistance techniques are the way to go, rather than repairing and even healing. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much to each one of these panelists who brought so much depth and passion into this discussion. I think we began by looking how Christ was represented in a particular image. But this conversation moved us to looking at what Christ can represent. Not in an image, but what Christ or the Christological figure can represent in terms of transformation and change. What evolved is a definition of what a white Jesus is, and recognizing it's not just a painting or an image or something in a stained glass, but rather a system that marginalizes. We then moved back to the deeply Christological question of what can this Christ do? What does this Jesus do? To move away from a Christological understanding that draws from a hierarchical great chain of being to perhaps, though it was unsaid, to a more Trinitarian understanding of perichoresis, where each shares in the life of all, and that being a model for communitarian living. Friends, I think we have just begun to break some of this ground. We take these constructive questions forward tomorrow when we look at what models do we find within the church and within marginal communities of finding ways to be anti-racist in Christ. May I remind you that there is another session today in a couple of hours that will bring the Caribbean, North American, South American, and Latin American folk together. May I invite you to that. Have a very good day. Goodbye, and thank you so much. To our panelists, we invite you to another meeting after this for debriefing. Goodbye.
Thank you.